the interim, we'll turn it over to Beth to speak about Rwanda.
Darfur.
Darfur.
Right. So to give you a little bit of background of how I'm coming into this discussion, I had been in South Sudan just before the signing of the North-South Peace Agreement, which was this historic agreement to bring the end to 2 decades of civil war in the country, and doing a project on displacement. This was summer of 2004, and then I came back here to start at Harvard Law School doing my JD. And it was pretty much the month that I started that Colin Powell said on behalf of the US government the situation in Darfur, genocide. And so I was, a product of the class and generation that I was in, was very involved in mobilizing students around Darfur against a backdrop that I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with, the story that had been told about Rwanda, of the failure of citizens to really outcry. And there had been so much shaming work that had been done in terms of books written. A Problem from Hell was obviously key in that, but films that were made, a kind of public narrative that was drawn about the failure of us, of every one of us, to respond to what was happening in Rwanda. And our generation kind of took it on as being able to say, well, maybe that was our parents' generation, but we can do something different. And this catalyst of a movement that came from the use of the term genocide by the US government. So I was there doing my studies, being involved in this movement, but increasingly having questions about our impact. And I started doing some research looking at the impact of advocacy at the congressional level, which was fairly easy to pass out, fairly transparent, and also fairly positive. But what was more challenging was to understand what was the impact of all this public advocacy on the executive, which is where you really need to be getting at on a foreign policy issue. So I finished, and I actually went to work at the ICC during their Darfur case, but continued on this question and this interest in what actually is the impact, and is the citizen outcry that after Rwanda was posited in many ways as a salvation or the anecdote to a persistent failure of governments to respond to mass atrocity. Was the model wrong? Were we just implementing it wrong? What was accounting for the mismatch that there seemed to be between the energy that we were putting in on the advocacy front and the outcomes on the ground? So subsequent, beginning of this year, I got this fellowship from the Open Society Institute, which, if it's still going when you guys graduate, it's the most amazing thing in the world. It's given me the ability to go and conduct interviews to broaden it beyond the US government perspective, getting behind the kind of policy box on the US government side, and to get at some of that, not only at the UN, but at the African Union and the Arab League, all these other players that are so crucial to solving the situation in Sudan. So I've just come, it's unclear to me which country I'm in at any point this year. There's been so much travel, but I did actually get 2 visits to Darfur recently. And the first time, I spent all of August in Sudan doing interviews with the Sudanese government because I wanted to hear how they were reacting and what their perceptions were. And I got out to Darfur completely on my own, no institutional affiliation, which is pretty rare, and created some security and logistical challenges, but it meant that I had a lot of freedom to speak to people, and people had freedom to speak to me. 2 weeks later, I then went back accompanying the US Special Envoy for Sudan, Scott Gratian, which was a really interesting for me comparison side by side, those 2 trips so close in time, but you got such an interesting, you got such a different view of what was happening in Darfur. I mean, when you're on a government schedule, there's a lot that's available to you that is amazing from US government resources, but you're also constricted in a lot of ways. So it's really, I guess what I was thinking that I would talk about today is what I saw and the messages that were sort of coming out clear to me from this most recent time in Darfur. But before I launch into it, there's a point that is so obvious that I feel like we've stopped mentioning it on Darfur, which is that no operation that is taking place in Darfur right now, not the humanitarians, not the peacekeeping, none of it is taking place without the consent, or at very least the acquiescence of the Sudanese government. And I just pulled up to quote the outgoing head of the UN African Union, UNAMID, it's called Operation in Darfur. Rodolphe Adada said this as he was leaving. He said, this is a quote, "There is a government in this country which we can do nothing without. One could choose another way, invade the country, remove the government, and put a friendly one in its place. Otherwise, you must play with the government." Now, there is a lot of criticism to be made of Adada and his approach, but the essence of what he's saying there is basically the reality. And everyone who is on the ground in Darfur knows it. Everyone who's working in there knows that they can be kicked out at any time. And it's been this sort of overlay across the whole operation, whether it's on the humanitarian front or on the peacekeeping front, across the whole time in Darfur. And it has become sort of a trend that's been spotlighted and highlighted in neon lights since the Sudanese government kicked out 13 of the international aid agencies and disbanded 3 of the domestic organizations in March of this year.